We are concluding this series from Joseph, about Joseph, and we come to the end of his life. It's been a good series. It's been a good series for me as I've studied again his story, as I've kind of unpacked it a little bit to try and understand more of it. I've heard from a handful of you that it's been good for you as well to see Joseph's story interact and kind of cross-section into your story. It's been a good series for us to go. And Joseph has modeled for us a life of faith throughout all of life's twists and turns. He's modeled for us a way of staying faithful to the God who's ever near and present and close to us, that we'd be able to know that, to remain faithful. We come to the kind of end of his story. We're actually going to come to the end of his earthly life. We come to the ending of Joseph's life. And I've been kind of thinking about this lately, and I don't know why, I've been thinking about it. Maybe it's because this season of the year, our two oldest kids just had their birthday, so they're older, and for some reason Gina and I feel like we're still young and nothing's happening to us. Or maybe it's because about a week ago one of my friends pointed out more gray hair that's popping up in my beard, and it's just something that's continually I'm reminded of. That just, while I would like to think that I'm forever the young guy, and I'm just always perpetually this young person, I'm reminded pretty regularly now that I'm not really as young as I thought. And I don't really like that idea. I don't like the idea of getting older. I don't like the idea of having that. And here's the deal. The bigger issue is I don't want to look back on the last part of my life, or the last part of watching my kids grow up, or part of my life with Gina or anything else, and have regrets. I don't want to look back, or at least I want to have as little regrets as possible. As little regrets as possible. And there's something I think we can do on this side of our life before we get to the twilight years, or the kind of right off into the sunset kind of years of our life. I think there's some things we can do right now to kind of help us approach our life with intentionality, to approach our life with a sense of direction, or to approach our life with a sense of purpose, so that we're not just kind of floundering around. We can orient our life or prioritize our life in such a way where our daily living is centered on kingdom values. So that when we look back on the life that we've lived, in this short earthly life that we have, that we can look back and say we've spent our life well. While there may be some things that we would like to try again or like to see again, we can at least look back and go, we've spent our years well. And we can live intentionally. This is what I think you see in Joseph. He's lived intentionally, prioritizing kingdom values in his life from a very young age all the way through his life. And when he comes to the end of his life, he looks back on his life and he can say with integrity that he has lived his life well. That he's lived his life well. And I simply want to highlight 4 of these kingdom values that we see in the life of Joseph. And maybe some of these are by review if you've been around these last few weeks, but they're good reminders. They're good things for us to say again. And here's what I want us to do on these 4 kingdom values as we kind of go over them this morning. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to consider, how might your life look like? What might your life look like if these kingdom values were more incorporated in your daily living? If these kingdom values that you see in Joseph and you see as he kind of comes to the ending of his earthly life, if they were incorporated into your daily living, what might your life look like? And perhaps, just perhaps, as we go over these 4 kingdom values, one or more of them is going to grip you. I've been praying over these last couple of days as we've kind of leading up to today that the Lord would impress on your heart one or more of these kingdom values, that it would just kind of grip you and you would get a sense that the Lord is leading you to incorporate one or more of these values in a daily way into your daily life. That it will enable you to look back on your life with your kids or your family, your friends, your life with God, and you look back and you go, I've lived my life well. Lived my life well. So as we go over these 4, just prayerfully consider, where's the Lord leading and nudging and directing you? Which one or more of these values are you needing to incorporate more in your daily life? First value that we see in Joseph, and you see it here at the end as well, but this desire to honor God. Joseph has a desire to honor God. Joseph's first priority in his whole life is to honor God. More than money, More than fame, more than power, more than recognition, more than getting promoted, more than anything else, Joseph's desire is to honor God with his whole life. The driving force behind Joseph's life, and I would say the driving force behind a life that is lived well, is the pursuit of godly living, where your life is prioritized on honoring God, where you follow the ways of God, even when they're not easy to follow, even when they're unpopular, even when they're difficult, even when they can be confusing. We prioritize a life that honors God and his ways and not our own ways. You see this in Joseph's life. You see it in his approach to work. His work ethic was not in order to make his own name great. He doesn't work for Potiphar's glory, but he works for the glory of God. He takes to heart the biblical principle that whatever you do in word or deed, do it as if you were doing it to the Lord. He takes that to heart and he works his work ethic in a way to honor God. So you see this priority in his life all the way in there. His integrity in the face of temptation when Potiphar's wife comes and tempts him to sexual impurity. You see his integrity at work there. Desire to honor God. Remember that part of the story when Potiphar's wife comes and what he says to Potiphar's wife. He says, how can I sin against God and do this? It wasn't simply about maintaining an external facade. It wasn't just maintaining his position in Potiphar's house. It was, how do I honor God? And how could I not honor God by being integrity-filled? He looks at Potiphar's wife and he says, how could I sin against God with this? It wasn't just about pursuit of fame or fortune or money or power or prestige. It was a desire to honor God. You see it in his approach of humility before Pharaoh, where Pharaoh says, I've heard that you only need to hear about a dream and you can tell us what it means. And you remember what Joseph said? He said, no, I can't do that, but God can. There's a humility to Joseph that doesn't want the recognition on himself, but he gives praise and glory to God. He desired to honor God, to make God well known and be okay with taking second place or third or fourth or even in the shadows. You see his desire to give God glory, to honor God all throughout his life. His desire to pursue reconciliation while it's difficult and not easy and messy at times, knows that this kind of reconciliation and forgiveness honors God. And so he desires to honor God. He ordered his life around the kingdom value of honoring God first. Honoring God first. He settled in his heart a desire for God. Jesus instructs us about the same thing in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Deciding in your heart to prioritize a life that reflects the glory of God or the kingdom of God will help us to lead a life that is well and eternally satisfying, where we look back and we go, I have lived my life well. Not easy all the time. Kind of confusing at times. But a desire to honor God through all circumstances, and I look back and I can say that I spent my life well. So what does that mean for you? Well, how does that kingdom value make itself real in your life? How would the people around you know that your highest calling in your life was to honor God? How you used your words, how you used your time, your resources, your money, your space. How did that declare to other people that your desire to honor God, your integrity, your pursuit of God, do people recognize that kingdom value as a center driving force in your life? Second kingdom value we see in Joseph's life, and that is that he has a hopeful endurance. Hopeful endurance. See, hopeful endurance in Joseph's life is driven by a belief that God was moving in his life, that he was around, he was present. And his disposition or his inclination, God's inclination for Joseph was for good. And while it doesn't look good on the outside, and while his external circumstances certainly didn't look good, Joseph had hopeful endurance to walk through the painful times, knowing that the Lord is with him in the midst of those times. A key summarizing verse for Joseph's life is, and this hopeful endurance you see at the end of his life, Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. When he's talking to his brothers, he says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." He says, "You intended this to harm me, but God intended it for good." Joseph understands that God is able to take the most painful circumstances and work them together and redeem them for those who are called according to his purposes. That God is indeed able to work good throughout all of life's ups and downs. It doesn't mean that God causes all things to happen. Because the evil that happened in Joseph's life and the evil that happens in our life is just that. It's evil. It doesn't come from God. But God is able, and Joseph is able to recognize the hopeful endurance that God is able to work and maneuver through difficult circumstances, through the evil that we may experience, to experience his goodness all throughout. So you and I can have this hopeful endurance to make it through all sorts of trials and temptations and difficulties and evil that we face when we have the blessed hope that the Lord is present with us. With us. I wonder how that changes how we approach problems. Just the knowledge that the Lord is near us. As Wayne's picture depicted, that he's just right here. What does that do to change how you endure through the evil that we experience throughout our life? Third kingdom value is a concern for the next generation. You see this in Joseph's life, and you see it all throughout the scriptures as well. Not only does Joseph give a plan to alleviate people from the famine, he has this idea to think about people coming after him, not just to consume as much as he possibly can consume right now, but to think about those who are going to come after him and to set apart a plan to care for those that are coming after him. Not only does he do that, but he has a plan to care for and desire to care for the hopes and the spiritual life for those that are people are coming, that they would know the plans of God, that they would know that God is with them as well, because he knows that difficult times and things are going to come to them and trials and evil will come against them, and he wants them to know God's goodness in the midst of it. So not only does he set aside a plan to save them or to help them in times of famine, but he desires them to know God's plan for them, God's goodness for them. Listen to what Joseph says at the ending here, Genesis chapter 50, verse 24. He says it really plainly, "I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." You see, Joseph's vision for life with God wasn't just limited to his own experience. He longs for those that will come after him, his kids and his grandkids and his great-grandkids, and for all those that will come after him to experience God's goodness and experience the life with God. He says, "I'm about to die. My earthly life is about up here. But God will continue to be with you. And he will continue to show himself to be faithful to you. You will experience it. He will keep his promise to you." Joseph has a desire and a concern for future generations, both practically and spiritually. A few generations later, Moses would have the same kind of description in Deuteronomy chapter 6 when he says this to the people of Israel. "These commandments I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk around along the road and when you lie down and when you get up." Because the people of God have always had a concern to pass along faith, to remind people, the next generation and the generations to come, of the story of God and his faithfulness, and that God will be true to his promises, to remind them of the story of God's faithfulness in the past and to call them to hopeful endurance in the times in the future. There's just something very meaningful, very rich, very powerful when you have an opportunity to share your story, your faith, and what God has taught you with those who are younger than you. To help them, to lead them to a faithful endurance, to help them to know this God who is so faithfully near to them, to experience the goodness of God in their life. There's something just rich and meaningful and powerful about that. For those who are young in their marriage, just newly married, Well, they need people who are married longer, who've been following God in their marriage, prioritizing Christ in the center of their marriage. They need those of us who have been married longer to walk alongside them, to share wisdom of how you place Christ in the center of your marriage, to show them God's faithfulness, to be concerned about them. New parents, when they come home from the hospital with those little babies, they have no idea what they're in for. And they think they're failing all the time. And they think they're never doing anything right. They need parents that have walked this road before, and they've been faithful to God, and they've seen God's faithfulness to watch over their kids, to pray for them. They need older parents to walk with them, to remind them that though it may feel like you're sleep deprived and you have no idea what you're doing, that God is still near you. That God is still near you. And for way too long, people have assumed that you get to this kind of time in your life, this point in your life where you just kind of sit on cruise control and you just kind of ride off into the sunset. And that's it. That's the part of your season there. Can I just tell you that is so contrary to the biblical record? That is so contrary to what you see in Joseph's experience, that right up to the very end, Joseph is concerned for the next and the next generations, to pass along faith, to share the story. For Joseph, his concern was the people of God would tell the story of God to the next generation. Concern for future generation can come in all sorts of ways, shapes, and sizes. Maybe it's really intentional. Maybe you find someone who's 10 to 15 years younger than you, and you set up a time and you meet with them specifically for coffee or something else, a dessert or whatever, and you ask them specifically, how are you pursuing Christ? And how are you seeing Christ and His life in your life? And you point them to faithful obedience to God's call in their life. Maybe it's really specific and it's very intentional in that kind of relationship where you find someone that you can walk alongside and you have very poignant conversations with them. Maybe it's just as simple as providing a meal for a new parent. You just go to their house and you sit with them and you provide enchiladas for them. Because everybody likes enchiladas. And you sit with them and you just be with them. And you remind them that they're not forgotten, that they're not just on their own, that God is with them. Maybe our young people are going to have a spring retreat or a fall retreat, and you decide to host our teenagers in your house. You just provide a home for them to be there. And you get breakfast for them, you get dinner for them, you just kind of hang out with them, and you're concerned about our young people and passing on faith into their life. Maybe it's something like that. Maybe it's as simple as this, that you get to know the name of someone who's 10 to 15 years younger than you. And maybe you don't meet with them at all. Maybe you don't talk to them at all. Maybe you just know their name, you know a little bit about them, and you commit to pray for them regularly for their well-being spiritually, for their protection. And you just simply come before the Lord on their behalf on a regular basis. See, friends, whatever the outpouring, the practical outpouring is, being mindful of future generations is a kingdom value, and it's worth exploring. But how can we hold this value in the center of our life? To live a life well. Live a life well. Well, fourth and final value I want to review or talk a little bit about with Joseph is the priority of forgiveness. The priority of forgiveness. Despite everything that Joseph has gone through, despite everything that has come his way, Joseph remains a man of forgiveness, of deep forgiveness. He simply refused to let bitterness remain in his heart. He simply refused to let anger and resentment and bitterness to fester. He was a man of forgiveness. And I would say few things are more discouraging or disheartening when you witness someone who's coming to the twilight years of their life and they just remain bitter and angry and resentful. Few things are more disheartening than you see someone growing older and they just get bitter, more angry, more resentful. Seems like every word that comes out of their mouth is just spewing hatefulness and anger. Joseph was a man who pushed against bitterness and he prioritized forgiveness. Regardless of what came his way, he remained all the way to the end of his life a person who prioritized forgiveness. Forgiveness. A capstone on his life was the way in which he pursued forgiveness, reconciliation, rightness with one another. At the end of his story here, Genesis chapter 50, 15, verses 15 and on, he says this, or it says this. Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead. They said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they've committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? I will provide for you and your children." He reassured them and spoke kindly to them. See, here's the deal. Joseph's brothers had experienced his forgiveness, but they weren't quite sure if it was complete. They weren't sure if his forgiveness was just kind of conditional because their old man was still alive. And once he died, well, then now comes the wrath of Joseph. Now it's going to come down. They were fearful that now that Jacob had died, that Joseph was going to come after him. He was going to pay him all back for all the stuff that they had done wrong. Though it was years ago, though the words of forgiveness had been spoken, they were fearful that the words were conditional on Jacob still being alive. Joseph hears their words and he weeps for them. He weeps for them. And he comes to them and he reassures his brothers that the guilt and the shame of past behaviors, well, that's been covered by complete forgiveness. He reassures them. For one reason or another, they had this guilt in their life, this shame, this stuff that they had done, and he reassures them because he was a man who prioritized forgiveness. And if I could be as bold as I can this morning, maybe a little irritating, but I believe that there probably is somebody in your life. In fact, I can probably guarantee that there's someone in your life who needs to be reassured of your love for them. There's someone in your life today that needs to be reassured that while you may have spoken the words forgiveness, they need to be reassured that it wasn't conditional. For one reason or another, they are living with a low-grade sense of fear and guilt and shame in their life over past mistakes, things that they have said or done. And they are afraid that one day the other shoe is going to drop, and you need to reassure them that your forgiveness is complete, that you're not holding on to those things. Joseph heard his brother's concern, and he weeps for them because the kingdom value of forgiveness is a priority in his life. It's a priority in his life. And I simply want to suggest this morning that if you and I can prioritize kingdom values of honoring God first, where it's his glory, not mine, the kingdom value of hopeful endurance, where we recognize that God is able to walk and is near us in the midst of our difficult trials and evil that is around us. Or if we carry on the kingdom value of concern for the next generation, both practically and spiritually, and we prioritize the way of forgiveness, then you and I will come to the sunset years of our life, look back, and while there may be some things we could do again, we would look back and say we've spent our life well. Spent our life well. So as we conclude the series here, so we kind of close the book on Joseph and all the lessons we've learned, let me ask you one final question this morning. Which one of these 4 kingdom values do you sense the Lord inviting you to incorporate more in your daily life? Which one of these 4 kingdom values do you need expressed more in your daily living? My prayer is that this would be way more than just an inspiring story that we can think about that happened a few thousand years ago, but that Joseph's story would spark you and I towards faithful obedience in God's ways. Let me pray for us. Jesus, we need you. We humbly ask that you would meet us in our times this morning, that you would remind us of your desire for good, and that your kingdom is always an abundant, eternal, satisfying kingdom. And may we turn from our kingdom and live eternally in yours. And may we prioritize your values. It's in your name we pray.